poor girl begged a paralyzed judge. "Free my dad, I'll heal you." And then, the sound of handcuffs snapping shut cut through the night like thunder. Outside a glowing pharmacy window, Robert Hayes, a weary construction worker, stood trembling as police pulled the stolen medicine from his jacket. Behind him, the city kept moving, neon lights mocking the desperation of a father with nothing left to lose. At home, his 7-year-old daughter Lily struggled to breathe, her tiny chest rising and falling like a clock running out of time. A man broken by grief, a child on the edge of life. What would you have done in his place? Stay with me till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far the truth really spreads. Lily pushed herself up from the hard bench, her small hands clenched into fists as if holding back fear. Her voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger as every eye turned to her. She called out to the judge, begging not to take her father away, her words spilling out with the innocence only a child could carry. She promised that if her father was allowed to come home, she would help the judge find the strength to walk again. The room reacted in waves. Some people gasped, moved by the raw purity of her plea. Others shook their heads, whispering that the girl was only confused. A few even laughed quietly, mocking the idea that a child's promise could carry any meaning in a place of law. But Judge Catherine Moore did not laugh. She sat frozen in her wheelchair, staring at the girl who stood so bravely in front of her. For 3 years she had buried her own pain under strict rules and cold judgments. Yet in that single moment, something cracked open inside her chest. She looked at Robert, sitting broken at the defendant's table, his eyes wide with shame and hope tangled together. Then back at Lily, her cheeks flushed, her small frame shaking but her gaze never wavering. Catherine felt her throat tighten. She had heard countless excuses in her courtroom, but never a child's vow spoken with such fearless devotion. And in the silence that followed, one question echoed inside her mind. Could a little girl really awaken the part of her that she thought was gone forever? 3 weeks earlier, Robert Hayes woke before dawn as usual. His hands were calloused from years of construction work, but he still managed to butter a slice of bread and pour a glass of milk for Lily. She stirred under her blanket, and he kissed her forehead before heading out to the job site, the same routine since his wife had passed. That evening, the cold crept through the cracks of their small apartment. Lily coughed in her sleep, her small chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Robert rushed to her side, holding her trembling body as she whispered she could not breathe. He grabbed the inhaler, but the canister rattled empty in his hands. Panic surged through him as he shook it, trying to force out a single spray. He pressed her to his chest, whispering lullabies his wife once sang, hoping to calm her until the coughing eased. When she finally slipped into a shallow sleep, Robert stayed by the bed, staring at the ceiling with his face buried in his palms. He had already sold everything worth anything. His wedding ring, his watch, even the old car filled with memories. Each sacrifice had kept Lily alive for another week, but it was never enough. The next morning, her fever burned hot under his hand. She could barely open her eyes. Robert called his boss, his voice breaking as he begged for an advance, but the response was a cold refusal. He hung up, staring at the peeling paint on the walls, feeling them close in. As the sun went down, he sat at the kitchen table, bills scattered in front of him. He held the last envelope in his hand, but could not bring himself to open it. His mind screamed at him to be strong, to endure, but his heart broke at the sound of Lily coughing in the next room. He thought of his wife, wondered if she would see him as a failure, or if she would forgive him for doing whatever it took. Finally, he stood, pulling on his worn jacket. He kissed Lily's damp forehead and whispered he would be back soon. His footsteps felt heavy as he walked into the night, toward the pharmacy glowing under the streetlights. Inside, shelves lined with medicine stretched before him, the answers to his daughter's pain within reach, yet beyond his grasp. His hands shook as he picked up the inhaler and fever reducer, pressing them to his chest like they were treasures. He closed his eyes, a war raging inside him. His conscience told him it was wrong, but his love screamed louder. He thought, if saving Lily made him a criminal, then so be it. He slipped the medicine into his pocket and turned toward the door. For a moment, he let himself believe he had done it. He imagined walking back into their small apartment, placing the medicine by Lily's bed, and watching her breathe freely again. Then a hand gripped his shoulder. The security guard's voice was firm but not cruel, asking him to empty his pockets. Robert's hands trembled as he pulled out the medicine, tears already welling in his eyes. He begged for mercy, explaining his daughter was sick, that she might not survive the night. The guard's expression softened, but rules were rules. The police were called, and Robert soon found himself in handcuffs under the fluorescent lights. As they led him away, his heart broke with each step, knowing Lily was at home, waiting for a father who would not walk back through the door that night. Robert sat at the defendant's table with his shoulders heavy and his eyes fixed on the floor. His hands were folded tightly, as if he could hold himself together by force alone. Every breath he took carried the weight of shame, but also the image of Lily gasping for air at home. The prosecutor, David Chen, stood tall and sharp, his voice cutting through the silence. He declared that stealing was still stealing, no matter the reason. If the court allowed sympathy to excuse the law, he argued, then order itself would collapse. His words rang with logic, but without an ounce of mercy. Sarah Miller, the exhausted public defender, rose slowly. She spoke of Robert's clean record, his hard work, and his desperate love for his daughter. Her voice cracked as she reminded the court that a father faced an impossible choice: watch his child suffer or risk everything to save her. She begged for understanding, not as an excuse, but as recognition of his humanity. Judge Catherine Moore listened with a face carved from stone. She had heard similar pleas in countless cases, and her role was to protect the law, not bend it. Yet, as her gaze drifted to Robert, something unsettled her. His hollow eyes did not belong to a criminal chasing gain, but to a father crushed by helplessness. David's voice rose again, insisting that pity had no place in justice. Catherine nodded as if in agreement, but inside she felt a fracture. She remembered her own nights of pain, trapped in a body that refused to obey, and the loneliness that followed. For the first time in years, she wondered if the law could see a person's heart as well as their actions. The doors of the courtroom opened, and Lily rushed in before anyone could stop her. Her small shoes slapped against the floor as she ran straight to her father. She threw her arms around him, sobbing so hard her words broke into gasps. Robert dropped to his knees, clutching her tight as if letting go would mean losing her forever. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered apologies, telling her he had made a terrible mistake. He begged her to forgive him, his voice cracking under the weight of shame and love. Lily buried her face in his chest and shook her head. Between sobs, she told him she knew he only wanted her to breathe, that he was not a bad man. The room grew quiet as people watched the little girl defend her father with nothing but her fragile, honest heart. Even those who came to condemn him lowered their eyes, their harsh judgment softened by the rawness of the scene before them. A few hands reached for handkerchiefs, dabbing at tears they could not hold back. The heavy air of accusation shifted into something tender, something human. Judge Catherine Moore sat frozen, her hand resting on the arm of her wheelchair. She had trained herself to separate feeling from duty, to listen only to facts. But as she looked at Robert trembling with grief and Lily clinging to him with desperate love, she felt a crack inside the wall she had built around her heart. It was small, but undeniable. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of another person's pain reach her. She could not yet name it, but she knew this moment would not leave her untouched. The room was still heavy with silence when Lily slowly pulled away from her father. Her cheeks were wet, but her steps were steady as she turned toward the judge. Each small footstep echoed until she stood at the bench, looking up at the woman who held her father's fate. Catherine's face remained composed, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. She had stared down hardened criminals without blinking, but now she felt strangely unsettled by a child's presence. Lily reached out her tiny hand and placed it gently over Catherine's. The warmth startled her. For 3 years, Catherine's hands had only known the cold steel of her wheelchair and the weight of law books. Lily's hand was small, fragile, and yet it carried a strength that seeped into her skin. In a voice soft but sure, Lily whispered that she could see the judge was not only hurt in her legs, but tired in her heart. She promised that if her father was given a chance, she would stay by Catherine's side to help her be strong again. Her words carried no fear, only pure conviction. Catherine felt something rise in her chest, a rush of emotion she had long buried. She wanted to dismiss it as childish nonsense, yet the honesty in Lily's eyes pierced straight through her defenses. For the first time in her career, she could not separate the law from the life in front of her. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, ready to object, but his words died as the room seemed to lean toward the child. Even the jurors, even the crowd, seemed to hold their breath. It was not law that filled the air, but the fragile possibility of mercy. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, hearing the echo of her own loneliness, the years of bitterness chained to her chair. When she opened them again, Lily was still there, her hand resting lightly, her gaze steady. Catherine realized that this little girl was offering her something she had not felt in years, hope. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but trembling with a new kind of weight. She declared that the sentencing would be postponed. Robert's case would remain open, not to erase the law but to leave room for the humanity she had just witnessed. The decision was unlike anything she had ever made, but she knew it was the only one her heart could accept. And as her words settled over the courtroom, Catherine felt the faintest crack of light breaking through her darkness. Robert began to notice things about Lily that he had once overlooked. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had been struggling with her aching back, unable to move without pain. Lily sat beside her, held her hand, and spoke softly until the woman's worried face eased into a tired smile, as if the little girl's presence alone lifted some invisible weight. One afternoon, Robert watched as a boy from the building scraped his knee on the sidewalk. While others passed by, Lily knelt down, wiped his tears, and whispered something that made him laugh through his sobs. Robert stood back in silence, realizing his daughter carried a gift that was far more powerful than medicine. Judge Catherine Moore saw it too when she met Lily again by the duck pond. Lily tossed breadcrumbs to the water, then showed Catherine how to lift her arms, sway her shoulders, and let her body remember joy in its own way. Catherine hesitated, then followed, her movements stiff at first until tears spilled down her cheeks. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something shift inside her. She was not dancing with her feet, but her spirit moved, light and alive. Lily clapped with delight, her laughter echoing across the pond, while Catherine covered her face, sobbing not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of feeling human again. Dr. Harrison laid out the possibility with measured words. A new surgical procedure had shown promise, but the risks were high. Catherine listened from her wheelchair, her fingers digging into the armrests, fear pressing down harder than the chair itself. For 3 years, she had taught herself not to hope. The idea of walking again felt dangerous, like reaching for fire only to be burned. She nodded politely at the doctor, but inside her heart was filled with dread of another disappointment. When Lily arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere shifted. She climbed onto the edge of Catherine's bed and slipped her small hand into the judge's. Her voice was soft but steady as she reminded Catherine that she was not alone, that her heart still carried the rhythm of a dance that had never truly ended. Catherine felt her composure crumble. Tears slid down her face as she turned to the little girl who had already awakened something she thought was lost forever. She wanted to argue, to explain her fear, but Lily's quiet presence made the excuses fade before they reached her lips. At last, Catherine whispered that she would try. The words trembled, but they were real. For the first time in years, she chose not to surrender to fear, but to step into the unknown with hope guiding her. The operating room was bright and cold, the silence broken only by the steady beeping of monitors. Dr. Harrison stood over Catherine, his hands steady but his brow damp with sweat. Every movement had to be precise. Around him, the team moved quickly, their eyes locked on the fragile work of repairing nerves that had been damaged for years. Outside, the waiting room was heavy with tension. Robert sat forward, his hands clasped so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Lily leaned against his arm, whispering softly that love was stronger than fear. Her words, spoken with the innocence of a child, carried a weight that calmed him more than reason ever could. Inside, one of the nurses fumbled as a clamp slipped from her gloved fingers and clattered against the tray. She froze, eyes wide, but Dr. Harrison's voice was low and firm, guiding her back into rhythm. His hand trembled for a moment before he steadied it again, the gravity of the surgery pressing down on him. Outside, Lily bowed her head. Her small voice filled the sterile room with a kind of warmth that seemed out of place there. She prayed in her own words, asking not for miracles but for strength, asking that Catherine's heart remember the joy she had forgotten. Robert listened, his chest aching, realizing his daughter carried more courage than he did. The hours dragged on. Harrison adjusted his instruments again and again, searching for damaged tissue hidden deep inside. His shoulders were stiff from the strain, but he did not stop. The anesthesiologist watched every breath, every number on the monitor, the air so tight with tension it seemed no one could exhale. In the waiting room, Lily lifted her father's hand and pressed it to her cheek. She whispered that Catherine was not alone, that the rhythm of her heart was like a song waiting to return. Robert closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him, steadying the storm inside him. Back inside, Harrison's mask shifted as he exhaled sharply. For a moment, his fingers twitched with fatigue. A younger nurse glanced at him nervously, her eyes wide with fear, but he gave her a brief nod. They all knew the risk, but they pushed forward, step by step, stitch by stitch. At last, after long hours of silence broken only by commands and instruments clicking into place, Harrison set his tools down. He stepped back, chest rising and falling as though he had been holding his breath for the entire operation. The team exchanged weary glances, their eyes saying what their mouths dared not. The hardest part was over. The doors opened, and Harrison walked into the waiting room, his posture slumped with exhaustion. Robert stood instantly, words failing him. Lily's hand clung tightly to her father's, her eyes locked on the doctor's face. Harrison drew in a slow breath. He told them Catherine had survived, and for the first time in years, she had a true chance at walking again. Relief struck Robert so hard his knees nearly buckled. Lily simply smiled, as if she had known all along. When Catherine returned to the courtroom weeks later, the room was packed. Her body was weaker than before, but her voice carried a strength no one expected. She announced that Robert Hayes would not serve prison time. Her decision stunned many, especially prosecutor David Chen. He rose to object, but Catherine lifted her hand. She said justice was not only about punishment, it was about giving people a chance to stand again when life had beaten them down. Robert stood frozen, his eyes filling with tears as he listened. For months he had braced for the worst, prepared to lose his daughter to the system. Now, with a single decision, the weight lifted from his shoulders. Catherine went further. She told Robert she had already recommended him for a job as a maintenance supervisor at the hospital, a position with health insurance that would keep Lily safe. She explained that a man who had fought so hard for his child deserved more than a cell. He deserved a chance to rebuild. Robert turned to Lily, pulling her into his arms. His voice broke as he thanked her, as if she had carried him through every step of the trial. The gallery erupted in applause, strangers wiping tears from their eyes. And behind the bench, Catherine sat still, her heart beating differently than it had in years. She realized she had not only freed a father, but she had freed herself from the cage of her own fear. A few months later, the courtroom doors opened, and all eyes turned. Judge Catherine Moore entered slowly, leaning on crutches, her steps careful but steady. The room rose to their feet in applause, the sound filling every corner with warmth. For 3 years people had only seen her behind the bench in her wheelchair, but today she stood on her own, proof that something had changed. She reached the bench and paused, letting the noise settle. Her voice carried across the room with a softness that was new to her. She said it was not only the surgery that brought her here, it was a little girl who reminded her that love has power stronger than fear, and that hearts can be healed before bodies follow. The crowd listened in silence, many with tears shining in their eyes. Robert sat in the front row with Lily on his lap. He held her close, knowing his daughter's spirit had altered more lives than he could count. Catherine looked toward them as she spoke, gratitude in her gaze, as if acknowledging that her second chance began with them. 6 months later, sunlight streamed into a small garden where friends gathered for a quiet wedding. Catherine stood in a simple gown, holding Dr. Harrison's hand as vows were exchanged. When the music began, she let him guide her onto the floor. Her steps were slow and cautious, but her smile was radiant. For the first time in years, she danced. Lily scattered rose petals down the aisle, her yellow dress swaying with each step. She turned to her father, whispering that miracles are not magic. Miracles happen when people believe they can endure. Robert felt his throat tighten as he nodded, pulling her close, knowing she was right. As Catherine swayed to the music, she glanced toward Lily and Robert. She saw not just a father and daughter, but the proof that hope could ripple out and touch a whole community. Around them, friends and neighbors clapped in rhythm, their faces lit with belief that life could always be rebuilt. The night ended with Robert lifting Lily into his arms. She rested her head on his shoulder, her small hands holding onto him with quiet trust. Across the garden, Catherine met their eyes and smiled, no longer bound by fear, but lifted by faith. In that moment, it was clear. Miracles were not rare wonders. They were the strength found in love, and now everyone believed. From a desperate father's plea to a little girl's promise, and finally a judge who found her way back to hope. This story reminds us that love can change destinies. Compassion, family, and courage are not just private virtues, they are the forces that can heal broken hearts and inspire miracles in all of us. If this story touched you, share your feelings in the comments, subscribe, like, and share our channel, Emotional Echoes, so more hearts can be reached. Together, let's keep believing in love stronger than fear. Thanks for listening.